Welcome back and congratulations. You are part of the rare few who actually expose themselves to this material. So, what have we learned in the section of the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali called Sādhana Pāda? Well, Sādhana Pāda is the chapter of practice. Sadhana is how your day-to-day lived reality shifts after your initiation into and entrance onto the path of yoga. It's the bridge between philosophy and embodiment, so to speak. The agony and ecstasy, the actual lived experience of bringing the practices into and applying them to your day-to-day life. Because anyone who has encountered a teacher or had some other kind of initiation event enter their lives knows that things start to become more than a little different, right? Your awareness shifts and your relationship to life begins to unfold in a whole new way. Everything takes on a different quality. There is a distinguishing before and after, right? And what's interesting is that Patanjali actually names exactly what this lived practice consists of very early on in the section. Sutra 1. Tapas, Svādhyāya, Īśvara, Praṇidhāna, Kriyā Yoga. Practice is discipline and heat. Tapas, self-study and surrender to a higher intelligence. So right from the beginning, we're told this isn't some abstract philosophy. This is the very practical application about how you meet your life with yogic effort, how you relate to yourself, and how you orient to something larger than your own personal will, both within your own mind and in your real life, day after day. All of a sudden, there's a kind of grounded and reflective air to what might have before been some kind of a nebulous or vague wandering or seeking. And you begin to realize that wisdom grows through the dancing along the various paths and lines and boundaries of philosophy and ideas and applications in your daily encounters and events. And you notice yourself making shifts and changes in response, right? Especially in your day-to-day interactions with people and relationships. A space opens, or a gap between stimulus and response, right? You notice yourself sometimes consciously and other times unconsciously applying new ideas and understandings and experimenting, right? You become like a scientist, right? This is the laboratory, Earth School. Life is the lab where you practice and discover the science of yoga. So what Sādhana Pāda is really about is training your perception, right? Practicing, but not getting stuck in the practice. Keeping everything moving forward. You're studying and you're practicing. You're learning and you're applying. You're trying and you're failing. You're trying and you're succeeding, right? You're trying and getting the same outcomes, trying and getting new outcomes. This creates an internal condition for clarity and an increasing ability to discern truth and reality and engage in right action and what can only be called incredible freedom, right? It's about zeroing in on and learning to reduce suffering at the root through correct orientation and understanding. And Patanjali is really explicit about what these roots are in Sutra 3. Avidya, asmita, raga, dvesha, abhinivesha, klesha. Ignorance, ego identification, attraction, aversion, and fear of loss or death are the sources of suffering. And this is not a judgment, right? This is more of a diagnostic map. We're not being harsh with ourselves. It's about seeing clearly and attributing everything that arises to its true and correct origin. The veils and the sheaths. Remember? The unclear, distorted perceptions resulting from the pairs of opposites and their retinue of different configurations and how they dance and play on the stage of our lives, right? And what makes this chapter so empowering is that it doesn't stop there, right? We learned more about and dove deeper into how the Kleshas, the afflictions, participate in the creation of or unwinding of the karma and the suffering. Sutra 16, Heyam Dukam Anagatam. Future suffering can be avoided. By revisiting some of the earlier lessons and expanding upon the ideas that were there, we start to understand that the latent impressions are playing out, right? The samskaras. But now we're one step ahead of them, right? Because we have an idea about what's going on, or starting to. And by applying the philosophy and the practices around their arising, the suffering or consequences no longer play out. Or maybe sometimes they do. But we can begin to take responsibility without shame, because there's a deeper understanding being cultivated. And we can see how they're playing out, both in our own mind and in our lives. And we do this through repetition, right? You can observe how you keep having the same situations and scenarios playing out in your life at different levels and in different ways, right? You recognize the patterns and you start to take action, or different action, right? You engage with intentional, conscious application of the philosophy. Because merely understanding it intellectually doesn't dissolve the imprints, right? So, we're not fixing the symptoms downstream. We're intervening in the now moment at the level of perception and understanding and habitual response. Whoa, I see how that's happening. I'm not going to do that again, right? You might say that this chapter is about learning how to live inside reality with increasingly correct orientation, without getting all caught up in it, right? Remember? And now we're going back to section 1, Viveka and Vairagya. And now, of course, I'm thinking of Sri Guru Paduka Panchakam. Viveka Vairagya Nidhi Pradabhyam. Discrimination, discernment, and detachment are the gifts, the treasures, the jewels, bijou, that are bestowed upon us when we let go and surrender to a higher power. Discrimination, discernment, and detachment are enabled to be highly cultivated. This section lays out the intelligence of the system, beginning with Kriyā Yoga, right? This is where we strengthen ourselves through study and practice, persistence, intentionality, and discipline. This is how we work with the friction and pain of the effort that we're making in our daily lives, of watching it, noticing it, and trying to make the changes, right? Tapas, disciplined engagement through the burning, through the challenges and difficulties, exposing yourself to the teachings consistently, and learning and applying, seeing whether it works or not, right? Svādhyāya, self-study, is turning within and applying the teachings to your life and to your mind. We'll get to that a little bit later. Īśvara, Praṇidhāna, remembering that there is, and surrendering to a higher intelligence that is guiding the whole process, that has created this physical reality within which we are all scientists and students. Now, these are not abstract ideas, right? And once you start applying them in your life, you see how practical they are. How many times have you been like, I knew better, right? I should have done that differently, or I should have handled that differently, right? Almost as if some other force of habit or tendency was still strong enough that you couldn't intervene, right? You couldn't stop the momentum. These are the samskaras projecting outwards. And this is exactly what this section is addressing, how to move through those times, right? We learned more about and dove further into the Kleshas, the afflictions, how these latent impressions or samskaras embedded in the different layers and koshas of our body and energy field veil us in an ignorance of our own true nature. This avidya is the root and has tendrils which reach out into so many different areas of our lives, our hearts, our mind, and perceptions, right? Which cause us to do this or that, think this way or that way, interpret things a certain way. And how these misperceptions that we get all tangled up in create a cascade of conditions and circumstances and situations which plunge us into a web of suffering. And this is the root that we seek to pull out at the source, right? Because trying to fix symptoms downstream never works, right? It's like taking a pill to dull the pain without figuring out what the source of the pain is and healing that so that the pain isn't arising anymore, right? We're not working out here at the leaves, shaking the leaves off and cutting the edges of the branches, right? Bringing the practices in here, into the trunk, right? The heart, into the thought streams and the awareness, and then down into the root. And Patanjali makes something very clear about how this suffering happens, what the real root is, right? Sutra 17. Drishtir drishayo samyogo heya hetu. The cause of suffering is the misidentification of the seer with what is seen. And yet, Sutra 20 says, Drashta drishimatra shudopi pratyaya nupasya. The seer is pure awareness, though it appears colored by the contents of the mind. We're learning to attribute distorted perception to the correct source, right? The samskaras, the impressions on your karmic film. What's going on in your mind? This is not personal failure, right? We're all on some level going through the physical reality that consciousness has constructed in these ways. And this chapter gives us the full arc, right? Sutras 23 through 25 talk about how contact between the seer and the seen serves both experience and liberation. Through the experience of the ignorance which causes the seeming fusion, we gradually come to realization. And when ignorance increasingly dissipates, freedom dawns. So the work is not about rejecting life, right? It's about untangling perception within the day-to-day experience of lived reality. Okay, what's really going on here? Latent impressions, samskaras, will continue to arise, but now we're one step ahead of them, right? We begin to recognize the patterns and we take responsibility without getting caught in blame and shame loops. Because mere intellectual insight isn't what dissolves conditioning, right? It helps to understand, but it's awareness, right? Conscious, repetitive application is what changes it. We revisited and deepened our understanding of the yamas and niyamas, right? They're not necessarily rules, right? They're more like guidelines we increasingly try out and you practice and see how they apply to your life, right? And your practice and application can gain momentum the more you bump up against them, right? I'm really good at that, bumping up against them, going over, oh, reel yourself back in, Melissa. Because there's no such thing as perfect practice, right? And you aren't performing so you can win a medal or feel worthy, right? Though you might go through a phase where you do play that out. I did that. Like, I have to do this perfectly. I have to do it exactly as, which is fine. These universal restraints and observances will naturally strengthen and become refined and more natural to you as your perceptual awareness clears up. So then they become more like the wisdom that results from experience and an increase in clarity. Your understanding of and embodiment of them increases as you encounter the regressions or violations which show you where your perception is still distorted. And everything becomes increasingly clearer through more consistent practice in all aspects of your life as you make more and more connections between things, right? In fact, Patanjali tells us how clarity grows. Sutra 28. Yogan ganam anushtanad ashudi ksyaye yanadiptir aviveka kayate. Through sustained practice, impurities diminish and discriminative wisdom shines forth. And when we encounter disturbing or difficult thought patterns, he gives us a direct method to address them, right? Sutra 32. Vitarka badhane pratipaksha bhavanam. When the mind is disturbed by improper thoughts, constant pondering over the opposites is the remedy. Does this sound familiar? Like, this is cognitive behavioral therapy 101, but 2,000 years it's senior, right? This stuff is not new. It was not created by some guy in the 50s. Sutra 34 talks about how thoughts rooted in greed, anger, or delusion, whether acted on or not, perpetuate suffering. Therefore, pratipaksha bhavanam, reflect on them and replace them. Right? This is reframing. This is conscious redirection, training the mind, intervening on your own behalf, disciplining the mind, refining the instrument of the mind, sharpening the sword of the mind, right? We began diving into the mind-body energy relationship, right? Sutra 46, Sthira Sukham Asanam. Posture is steady and easeful. Have you gotten to that place in your meditation practice where you just can't wait to sit on your mat or in your chair because you know once you're there, you can just melt, right? Because you've attained that steadiness and you can let everything else go? I hope so. Because as effort relaxes and your attunement deepens, Sutras 47 and 48 talk about how the dualities, the pairs of opposites, they lose their power to disturb you. And through pranayama, the regulation of breath and the prana. And what is prana again? An entirely different kind of matter which underlies all reality and interacts with the body and its internal organs and systems, as well as the energy bodies or kosas, in unique and particular ways. And you tap into this prana through the breath, through pranayama. And when you do that, Sutra 52 states, Tata Kṣiyate Prakasha Varanam. The veils covering the inner light are thinned and clarity emerges. These practices are not merely philosophical. They have physiological and psychological effects that refine the nervous system. It's nervous system work, right? It makes it capable of holding insight and meeting the pairs of opposites without losing balance. So what changes when you actually live the teachings? You might find that you have a greater capacity to be with the various discomforts that naturally come along with being a human being on planet Earth, right? Your capacity for awareness and self-regulation and conscious choice increases, right? How am I going to meet this? Like, how should I respond, right? Your ability to pause and consider rather than reacting and being triggered increases, right? There are sayings that the yogi is often given a lot of trouble, right? The yogi's life is not easy, right? It's just not an easy path. It is understood that we are strengthened and refined through unusual difficulty and tests of will, right? Not that you should choose difficulty. Don't do what I did. Practice is always deeply personal, and it always fits within the context of your own unique life and your own disposition and personality. Sadhana is not a separate thing from your life. It is your life. Your life is your perfect sadhana. It's all been perfectly arranged, right? There is always this inner-outer dynamic interplay which keeps you coming back to the mat day after day, right? Once you hop on the path and orient yourself within the context of sadhana or lived practice, your whole life becomes a classroom and playground for trying out and learning from these practices and through them, right? So what do you see in yourself and notice others struggle with the most? What has this section revealed to you about your own patterns? And how do you see them playing out in the world? Right? Because we learn a lot from seeing the world and other people as a mirror, right? You see what's happening out there, and then you turn within and apply it to yourself. In this way, if you see your life as your perfect, unique to you sadhana, and make it a habit of always reflecting upon what is seen, this really acts as a polishing agent, right? You polish your own reflective surface until the mirror is unblemished and clear and actually becomes a window more so than a reflective surface, right? You become the seer and not the seen. But that comes after much practice and very highly refined discernment. So can you see that yogic practice, sadhana, is a highly personal, deeply contextual, and considerably refined living experience, which results in what Patanjali refers to as pratyahara toward the end of the section. Sutras 54 and 55 say that when attention turns inward, vashyatendriyanam, mastery over the senses arises. Then the mind can completely withdraw the senses from the external world, so the yogi can begin practicing the next stage, internal or antaranga yoga, where we can command the awareness that everything unfolds from within, right? But now we're going to go on to section 3, Vibhuti Pada. And this is where we explore the special powers or perfections that begin to result from the consistent and disciplined application of these foundations of yogic practice. This is what you can look forward to: the purity, the clarity, the discoveries and self-mastery, which begins to further unfold as you deepen your relationship to your practice and see for yourself how it affects your experience of your life and your conscious perception over time. So again, what has this chapter revealed to you about your own patterns of suffering, your own ways of perceiving and responding to life, and the depth and intensity of your own yearning for freedom? This is deep work. The tapas, the intense burning of sadhana, it's not for the faint of heart. Sadhana is where we come into an expanded manifestation of being, which, depending upon your disposition and personality, becomes clarified and differentiated. Like when you underwent the individualization process in puberty and adolescence, right? This is the process of becoming a spiritual adult, a sovereign being, ultimately qualified to rule over an entire solar system. So keep going. And I'll see you in the next section. Vibhuti Pada awaits.